This is the social brain, and we can enumerate some of what I call the highly developed and human functions of the social brain. I've been very careful not to use the word unique here. People commonly like to try to find things that are unique about humans, but Darwin tried very hard in much of his work to do the exact opposite and demonstrate the continuities between humans and other primates. And we can do that for all of these, and we have all of these traits in at least rudimentary form in other primates, except of course the complex combinatorial aspects of language. So this is my list of the highly developed in human functions of the social brain: language, sense of self, highly developed mentalistic skill, thinking about what others are thinking, social emotionality, emotions having to do with social interactions, pride, guilt, embarrassment, as opposed to basic emotions, complex logical analytic skill, especially with regards to social scenario building, and finally complex regulated goal pursuit, what we do with most of our lives. And we can put all of these together. We have a self who uses logic and emotion and commonly speech to pursue goals in interactions with others. And though Darwin would probably not predict that you would be expected to admit it, that main goal would involve maximization of fitness, or pursuing the proximate mechanisms that have historically led to the maximization of fitness. So why then did the human brain evolve to be the social brain, to be so social, to have all of these integrated modules specifically for social functions? Well, series of genetic changes, mutations that were selected for just the same sort of situation as we saw for microcephaly, where we have the genes. Now we have to do something a little harder. We have to try to find the genes that underlie these traits. And to do so, we need to study variation, recognize, quantify, study variation in these social brain functions in current humans, like all of us here in this room, and connect variation in these traits to genetic variation. Now, the good bishop has been listening to this, and he is not impressed. He thinks we have strayed into the realm of metaphysics, where one cannot do science. And he says, and you may be saying, ha, you will never find genes for traits like those. Well, I think we need to try to educate the bishop a little bit about genetics and finding genes and how genes work. So our scenario for the evolution of the human social brain looks something like this. It's quite simple. A series of genetic changes. So these are mutations here that were strongly selected for. These mutations affected these important functions of the human social brain. Some of these social brain alleles became fixed in the human lineage, especially those that happened a long time ago. So a good social brain allele came along, spread throughout all of us humans, so we all have it. Many of them, especially those which occurred more recently in human evolution, are still polymorphic. There's variation among us still present in these social brain genes. And then every generation we are subject to new mutations of either small or large effect. And usually the larger they are, the more likely they are to be deleterious. So here's our segregating mutations here, and here are our new mutations. So we can study, it's best to study large-scale variation. This is large genetic changes that have a big effect on phenotype that we can see and that we can quantify. So we want to look for large-scale variation in social brain functions in current humans and relate this to genetic variation if we are going to satisfy Bishop Wilberforce. How do we do that? Well, let's look at large-scale variation in one direction. So here we have the usual development in humans of these traits. What happens when these traits are underdeveloped due to genetic sorts of alterations? Instead of language, we have no speech. We have a reduced sense of self. We have reductions in mentalistic skills. We lose these complex social emotions like pride, guilt, and embarrassment. Instead of having complex logical and analytic skill focused on Machiavellian social interactions, logic serves mainly as sort of mechanical, simple cause and effect purpose that is not associated with sociality. And then instead of complex regulated goal pursuit, we have no goal pursuit at all, no long-term planning and seeking of goals related to fitness. Now, you know actually what I have just described, and that is autism. In severe autism, we have a complete loss of speech. There is good evidence for reduced sense of self. Autistic children will commonly refer to themselves in the third person as opposed to using the word I. Mentalistic skills are specifically underdeveloped. Social emotions are specifically underdeveloped. Mechanical logic is present and often extremely well developed in the form of certain savant skills. You still have a large brain. It's just not dedicated for sociality. And then you have a lack of normal sort of goal pursuit and maximization of fitness. Formally, autism was defined by Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger back in the 1940s in the context of three conditions: deficits in social reciprocity and language, very specific social brain functions, as well as the presence of restricted interests and stereotypical behavior which are non-social. Incidence of autism, roughly 0.5 to 1%, but it's very important to recognize that we're dealing with a spectrum. It's not an either or. You have a spectrum from severe autism all the way up to normality. And this has certainly been well documented. The annual financial costs to society, I just have data from the UK, about 2.5 billion Canadian dollars, in addition, of course, to all of the emotional costs which are paid by the individuals and the families.